Okay. So she's up there. Okay.
Right. No, it's all good. Yeah, it's fine.
Alright.
Okay, that's what's the event called.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is your AV presentation.
So is she ready? She's ready to go? So you can hear me?
So you can talk to her.
Okay, all right. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's start. Peter, sit down. Right, so it's my great pleasure to welcome you this evening to the Energy Initiative seminar on energy access. So my name's Paul Lant. I'm a professor here in chemical engineering at the University of Queensland. And I'm a member of a research group that we established 4 years ago called Energy Poverty Research Group. We're a research group of 14 researchers that work in the area of energy access. Two of the presenters tonight are my colleagues from that research group too. So energy access is probably, if not the biggest energy challenge the world's going to face, it's certainly one of the biggest energy challenges the world's going to face. How do we take or transition 1.1 billion people who don't have electricity to electricity? How do you transition 2.8 billion people that don't have access to clean cooking fuels? That's 2.8 billion people in a world of 7 billion people. Some of those stats sound a bit bizarre sitting in a place like this, but that's the world we live in. And certainly one of the challenges our world faces over the next decade or two or three, hopefully the next two, is how do we transition those people to have electricity and clean cooking fuels while somehow not making the global climate situation a hell of a lot worse. And that's the big challenge that we work on, and certainly our first presenter works on. So it's my great privilege to chair the session this evening. We've got 3 presenters. I think in order to stick to time, we'll probably just go through the 3 presenters, and then I'll have a question and answer session for all 3 at the end of the session. So this is where the technology is going to work, and I'm assuming that Hannah can hear me. Hannah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. I can stop sweating now. So our first presenter, and firstly, Hannah, thank you very much for your time tonight and for participating in this event. It's great to have someone from the International Energy Agency. I've certainly read a lot of the reports you guys have written over the last few years, and they're certainly influential, and they certainly help direct a lot of our research. So Hannay Daly is our first presenter. Hannah leads International Energy Agency's analysis of energy access for the World Energy Outlook, the IEA's flagship publication, and she coordinates the IEA's engagement on SDG 7, Sustainable Development Goal 7. So incidentally, for people who didn't know, energy only entered the SDGs in 2015. Prior to that, there was no explicit statement of energy in any of the SDGs. So that was quite a big step forward. Prior to joining the IEA, Hannah was a research associate in energy systems at University College London Energy Institute, where she led the development of the UK Times model and other research projects. She holds a PhD from University College Cork in Ireland, and modelling energy and climate policies. Hannah, would you like to start?
Thanks a lot. I think I'd like to share my screen, but I'm afraid just the technology is not allowing me at the moment because I need you to stop sharing your screen. So apologies for the technology little interlude for now. Super.
So
I think I can do that. Now you should have my slides in front of you.
yeah, we can see them.
Great. Okay, that's super. So thank you very much for the invitation. Good morning from a cold spring morning in Paris. Good evening to, I hope, a nice balmy evening in Queensland. It's a real pleasure to talk to you here. I hope that my not being there in person doesn't take away from the seminar. I think that let's try to keep it as kind of interactive as possible. So I'd be happy to take questions at any stage. So thank you very much for the introduction. As in case anyone's not familiar with the International Energy Agency, we're an intergovernmental organization essentially created in the 70s in response to various global energy challenges, in response to energy security challenges. And since our role has evolved and our number of member countries has evolved to around 30, And we're really a think tank for understanding how the world can move to a cleaner energy future, how we can transition to sustainable and clean energy future. So I work for the World Energy Outlook team, which is a major part of the IEA's work. We produce the agency's flagship publication annually, which gives a global picture. It's seen as really the golden standard energy analysis. It produces a global picture of energy demand and supply across the whole world, across all fuels and technologies. And actually, since 2000, the World Energy Outlook has been bringing energy access to the international attention, and it has been bringing energy access. It was the first real international effort to put energy access on the global policy agenda, and we feel been very successful in that. We've done that by firstly tracking what the energy access situation is, because you can't understand and you can't change what you're not tracking. And last year, we produced a special report of the World Energy Outlook, a free report with free data that you can download online, which gives a new in-depth analysis of this of the energy access situation. Let's just show there we go. And why did we seek to do this new in-depth analysis? As Paul mentioned, the 2015 Sustainable Development Goals were adopted and for the first time included energy as a separate goal. This marked a departure from the Millennium Development Goals undertaken by the UN. And the SDGs really tried to seek to address the underlying causes of poverty rather than just the kind of headline targets of poverty themselves. That was one of the distinguishing features of the SDGs. So it talks about gender equality, it talks about environmental sustainability, it talks about equity, and it talks about energy as a fundamental prerequisite for human development, economic growth, sustainability. Another departure of the SDGs is in fact that it addresses both developing and developed countries alike, and that it addresses every single person in the world, not just say having poverty or having energy poverty. It seeks to eliminate these things by 2030. It seeks to get to zero. More political factors that happened in the past couple of years was the inclusion of energy access targets in many NDCs. So more than half of African countries, for example, in their submitted NDCs mentioned energy access as a priority, along with renewables and efficiency. And at the same time, there have been targeted government policies and increasing awareness of the centrality of energy to the achievement of other development objectives. So we really wanted to understand whether this political momentum is turning into something new, and whether the outlook is changing, whether we're more on track to achieving SDG 7 to universal access. But as my two headline figures have been revealed already, the report finds that still 1.1 billion people lack access to electricity, and 2.8 billion people still lack clean cooking access. One of the main things that we want to focus on is that people are disproportionately affected by these figures. Women, for example, very much bear the burden and spend around 5 hours each day gathering wood and cooking on polluting stoves. This severely limits their ability to participate in education, to participate in economic life, and to improve their prospects. The fact that they cook on polluting stoves also leads to an estimated 2.8 million premature deaths per year, which is a major global health burden. And for example, just to give you an idea of the scale of that is nearly twice the number of deaths related to malaria and AIDS combined. So we know what interventions can limit that, but the awareness around the clean cooking issue is not strong enough, and political momentum is really not strong enough either. But we are seeing trends beginning to accelerate and converge to really have an impact on how energy access is thought about and how energy access is provided. For example, for the case of electricity, you all must be familiar with this huge declining cost of renewables and the advent of digital technologies, which are transforming the energy access landscape. There are now more mobile phones in Africa than there are electricity connections. And business models which use mobile phone technology, which use this declining cost of solar and other renewables, and efficient end-use appliances and LEDs use these innovative business models to provide low levels of electricity access to people for the first time who would otherwise never have been able to afford it. And the question that we seek to answer from this report is whether this new political momentum, whether this technology progress is enough to bring universal access to modern energy by 2030, and if not, what more needs to be done. So looking back to understand what has happened in the past. And our analysis has shown that there's been sustained progress in electricity access in all world regions. The number of people without access fell below 1.1 billion people in 2016 for the first time, and that's coming from 1.7 billion in 2000. And India has been really leading this progress. The overall electrification rate has almost doubled to 82% in 2016, and I'll speak a little bit more about India in the future. Other countries in developing Asia are similarly making huge gains. China reached full electrification in 2015 after a decades-long probe targeting the last villages and the last people. 100 million people gained access in Indonesia, 90 million people gained access in Bangladesh since then. But the difference is really in sub-Saharan Africa. While there's been near universal access in North Africa, sub-Saharan Africa has very much lagged behind. While the access rate has overall grown, population has also grown, which means that now there are more people without access to electricity than there were at the turn of the millennium. There are signs of promise, as you see there. We've observed a peaking in the number of people without electricity access, and since 2014, the number of people gaining access has outgrown population growth for the first time. This is because of some tremendous progress made in a few select African countries, notably Kenya and Ethiopia, where very strong government targets have been made. A lot of international investment is going, the grid is being extended, and they have a very strong government commitment to this. When we look to the future, our analysis is underpinned by looking at the recent progress in policies and investments in every country. And this underlines what we call the new policy scenario, which is a look at basically where current policies and planned policies get us in the future with relation to our various goals. And many countries in Asia are on track to reaching universal access before 2030. And overall, developing Asia reaches an electrification rate of 99% by 2030. And India's efforts are really a huge driver. We see them for the first time being actually on track to achieving universal access by the mid-2020s, which is a tremendous achievement. Latin America and the Middle East similarly achieve near universal access, but the global progress stalls in sub-Saharan Africa because of uneven progress, and the number of people without access, while globally falls to around 670 million people in 2030, it becomes very, very much concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa. By 2030, 9 out of 10 people without access are in this region, and 90% of that is in rural areas, because the number of people gaining access fails to keep pace with population growth, which is still projected by the Yuwan to be very strong in countries where there are no policies for electricity access. To give you some more insight into India, it's really been a remarkable success, really matching China in terms of its electrification success over the last decades. 500 million people have gained access in India since 2000. You can see here between 2000 and 2016, both while the urban population has gained near universal access, despite this very strong rural population growth, the rural population without access has also been gathering. What's more, the actual pace of people gaining access has accelerated over the last 5 years. An additional 40 million people gain access every year, compared with 28 million before 2012. And this is because of really strong reaffirmed political efforts over the last 5 years and a very strong rollout of the grid. The gap between those with and without access in urban areas is mainly closed, and the rural electrification rate has climbed from 32% in 2000 to 74% in 2016. You can actually track these numbers in real time on an Indian government web portal, where they have each state mandatorily reporting household electrification rates. So you can see actually in 2018 now that number has climbed to almost 80% in rural areas, which shows that they're on track to meeting a very, very strong commitment. I should also mention that in the past few weeks, India has actually electrified every village in the country, which is again another milestone in its big electrification strategies. How have they gained access in the past? Over 99% of those who've gained access has been from has been from grid extension. And this has been the primary focus of government policy to date. The government is now tackling more decentralized renewables to reach those villages who are very far from the grid. And coal has fueled about 3/4 of new access since 2000 with renewables, 20%. That obvious impacts on CO2 and air quality in cities. But it has gone hand in hand with a very strong reduction in the number of people living in poverty and economic opportunities in the country. So there's obvious trade-offs there. However, so we see very strong progress in Africa. This is the satellite night picture taken of Africa, taken by NASA in early 2017. As you can see, despite having a huge population in the continent, sub-Saharan Africa will really largely remain in the dark unless the commitments made and successes achieved in countries like India will spread across the continent. Still, some 600 million people will be without access in 2030, and only 1 in 3 people living in rural areas would have access, according to our projections based on current policies and progress. This means that people will continue to rely on expensive and inadequate forms of energy like kerosene lighting or batteries or inefficient and polluting generators. They will not have appliances to make daily life easier. They will continue to have very limited economic opportunities. For example, the agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa has the lowest crop yields of any major world region. And the vast majority of energy that goes into agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa is human-powered or animal-powered. So it's got very, very low energy inputs and very, very low productivity. And that's why we've developed this strategy to go from where we see this new policy scenario in 2030 with 600 million people without access to achieving modern energy for all. And we have our analysis shows that when satellites take the picture in 2030, it should look like something like this. It's a bit pixelated, but this essentially shows that with modeling colleagues at the G.H. Roll Institute of Technology in Stockholm, we've analysed really where people live and where people can gain access. And we find that for a small increase in global energy investment, we can really leapfrog the development pathway typically taken in the past, and really open up a world of opportunities. This will require, or what is happening, is a shift in the electricity access paradigm. We've looked back at what fuels and technologies have powered electricity access in the past, and where it's going to come in the future, where these new technology trends are coming in the future. As you've seen with India, at the global level, coal and fossil fuels have really powered the main source of electricity access since 2000. But renewables are really becoming increasingly significant. While renewables have powered around 30% of new access in the past, many of those parts of the world which suffer from high levels of energy poverty have really very abundant renewable energy potential. And one example is Africa, where obviously the sun shines strongly, there's huge water, there's huge biomass, huge geothermal potential, which is very largely untapped. And we're seeing for the first time, again, an investment and trends going in Africa towards tapping this potential in the case of ending energy poverty. Since 2012, in fact, renewables have been the source of 70% of new access in sub-Saharan Africa, and renewables have fueled this acceleration in new electricity access. It's mainly hydro in Ethiopia, Cameroon, geothermal in Kenya. There's also some gas in Nigeria and the Ivory Coast, but really there's been a real paradigm shift here. Looking ahead to the future based on our analysis of where electricity access will come in the future, all major fuels are essential for electrifying populations, and it really depends on local circumstances. But the paradigm shift really continues to go towards renewables, and it's the source of access for around 3 in 5 people by 2030. It's both rural and urban areas. 44% of people gaining access with the main grid do so with renewables, as countries continue to tap into hydro, large solar, wind, and so on. But renewables are especially important in rural areas, and these cost reductions in decentralized technologies and these new business models, as I spoke about earlier on, are really an increasingly attractive and affordable electrification solution for households who would otherwise wait many, many years for a grid to arrive. We have a new analysis of how many people in developing countries actually benefit from electricity access with off-grid renewables. It's a very hard number to track because it's not something that is easy to ask a government how many people have solar panels on their households, especially in these parts of the world. But we estimate that around 33 million people in developing countries benefit from electricity access with off-grid renewables, something more than a solar lantern, but something that includes several appliances, small appliances, radio, lighting, mobile phone charging, and so on. And that's because of the spread of these new business models, which are making payments available to households and making this very accessible and affordable. So in the future, we see off-grid and mini-grid technologies, mainly fueled by solar PV, providing 2/3 of new access in rural areas. It's really a huge paradigm shift, especially in continents like Africa. And for our strategy to delivering universal electricity access in sub-Saharan Africa relies on an analysis of the relative attractiveness of the grid versus decentralized solutions. So we have an analysis at the level of 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer squared, which understands where populations are and where they will grow by 2030, what the electricity demand per household is for every country, which is backed up by IEA energy balances, where is the existing electricity grid, and where have governments published plans to extend that electricity grid. It looks at the terrain and the solar resource and other types of renewable resource, and it looks at, for each kilometre grid, what is the least cost electrification solution for that grid square. Is it to extend the grid? If it's a high population density area with a large electricity demand load, if it's close to an existing or planned grid, then it makes more sense for the grid to extend there. But if it's in a more sparsely populated area, if demands are low, if we project that renewables, decentralized renewables, continue to become very cheap, then the model more suggests that off-grid, mini-grid solutions are more attractive. And the modeling suggests that for those 600 million people, additional people who we are giving access to by 2030, a large amount do so with the grid, around 1/4 do so with the grid. Renewables, and mainly hydro, actually continue to make up the majority of connections from the grid because of these abundant resources. But really decentralized solutions, mainly solar PV, are responsible for the lion's share of the remaining people without access. And in fact, it's mini-grids who, when you model a case of everybody gaining access, the business case for mini-grids really gets stronger. And the majority of that 450 million people gaining access with decentralized solutions is actually with mini-grids. Because when you have a village, and if everybody has a fridge and a TV and several lights, then the case for the economies of scale that go with the mini-grid really begin to make sense. What does that mean for an additional investment? It means that an additional $26 billion per year is needed in electricity generation. That is over and above the $24 billion that is invested in the new policy scenario. And over 2/3 of this additional investment needed in this energy for all case is for decentralized renewables. So under the right conditions, the private sector needs to play a very important role in providing this additional investment. While it's a small amount kind of globally in terms of global energy investment, it's not enough for governments alone to bear. And the private sector is beginning to make inroads in providing electricity access. And business models are emerging to make this a reality. But this private sector can only enter a market where the right conditions, where the right policy conditions are in place. So achieving universal access will require policies, infrastructure planning. It will require certainty for developers to, in terms of the regime for for how they can charge for electricity, and for what the subsidy regime will be. Modern energy is also needed for productive uses to meet developmental goals, not just at the household level, and including productive uses in electrification strategies will also basically attract the private sector and make the case for decentralized companies to come in. So the political will and momentum is gathering, but it really needs to extend to all countries, or many people will get left behind. Next, just to underline very quickly 2 examples from Southeast Asia, which underlies the need for really flexible and pragmatic solutions. Southeast Asia, which we also had a special report for last year, which looked again at detailed geospatial analysis, has a very rich and varied environment, and again it defies this one-size-fits-all energy kind of solution for energy access. Just to give 2 examples from Indonesia. Firstly, in Papua, is relatively low population density, and it makes it a primary, basically a very good case for mini-grid and off-grid technologies, mainly powered by renewables-based generation, mainly small-scale hydropower and solar, actually. And this is the least cost option for the vast majority of the 1.6 million people currently living there, although other forms of generation and expansion of transmission lines are expected to also grow there. The situation is very different in East Java, in Indonesia, where the population density is around 80 times the level in Papua. And each of these villages here have been recently electrified, these 225 recently electrified villages. And they were on average only 13 kilometers away from an existing grid. So therefore, grid extensions form the bulk of new electricity connections, showing how governments need to kind of be flexible in their approach, be pragmatic according to what the local resource is, what the needs of the local area. They can also be pragmatic in terms of what new types of technologies they use. For example, in Papua, where the bulk of new connections come from decentralized technologies, innovative grid solutions, including small-scale gas-fired plants dotted around the island and fed by LNG terminals, small LNG terminals, also are playing an important role in bringing universal access. A second lesson from this is that the picture is not a static one. So the relative competitiveness of different fuels changes over time, and renewables become increasingly attractive when costs come down and fossil fuel prices edge higher. So we can see that providing universal access is really not incompatible with the pursuit of cleaner energy. I want to spend some time on clean cooking access, and I'm guilty sometimes of focusing on electricity access, even though I complain that when people sometimes talk about energy access, they only think about electricity. And we really need to refocus on clean cooking as a very important topic. Today, around 2.8 billion people don't have access to clean cooking, and this number, shockingly, has not changed since 2000. Even though absolute poverty has reduced dramatically since 2000, and all sorts of global kind of positive things have happened, electricity access deficit has reduced strongly. This number has not budged. 2.5 billion people rely on biomass, 120 million on kerosene, 170 million use coal, all of which have very grave health consequences, as I mentioned. 2.8 billion, half of the population of developing countries lack access. Some countries are showing some shifts. For example, there's been a very strong shift in Indonesia from kerosene to LPG, and there's been new programs promoting free connections to LPG in India, which have shown very promising signs of success. But still, most people living without clean cooking live in developing Asia, that's almost 2 billion people from that live in developing Asia, followed by sub-Saharan Africa. There we go. If we look ahead to the future again, We see modest progress to 2030, but still 2.3 billion people still remain without clean cooking access, which I'm sure you'll agree is not sufficient progress. Most progress comes from a switch to LPG in urban areas, which we're seeing in parts of developing Asia. For example, India accounts for around half of those who gain access in our central scenario. But at the same time, in 2030, while universal electrification is almost complete in developing Asia, the number of people without remains hugely significant, almost 600 million people in India alone. In sub-Saharan Africa, in fact, the shift is not rapid to keep up with the rise in population. There's simply no policy, very few policies in place in sub-Saharan Africa, so the number of people without access continues to increase. Meanwhile, an estimated 2.5 million premature deaths would still be associated with that level of biomass and coal use. To achieve clean cooking for all, we also have a clean cooking for all case. An additional 2.3 billion people need to gain access from a very wide variety of cleaner fuels and technologies, and all fuels and technologies are needed. The investment level is very modest, less than 1/10 of what is needed from universal access, but providing funds, we emphasize very strongly, is not enough. The solutions need to involve communities, especially women. It needs to take into account social and cultural factors from the outset. Often biomass is just what people want to use. It's what they've used for, since the dawn of civilization, and that's just so embedded in their daily practice. That's what they want. But the benefits would be massive. The number of premature deaths would be reduced from 2.5 million in 2030 without, according to our current projections, to 0.7 million in 2030. So I want to speed up a little bit as we're running out of time, and I want to just give you an overall picture of what the energy for all case means relative to the central scenario. And we find that the benefits obviously very much far outweigh the costs. So the overall energy for all case in global energy investment terms requires an additional nearly 2% of global energy investments. That's equal to around $31 billion per year. To give some context, last year the video game industry, the global revenues from the video game industry were $70 billion. So while that might seem a lot, it's really not that significant. And the benefits are huge. First of all, in terms of the amount of time spent gathering fuel wood, around 2 months of work saved for each woman or each family, mainly women, per year. That's equivalent to freeing up a workforce of 80 million people, which is half the workforce of the US. The economic and kind of economic productivity and just livelihood benefits to that can be huge. You can also avoid 1.8 million premature deaths. The health benefits are really staggering. And finally, one of our most strong findings and strong messages is that all can be achieved without a net increase in greenhouse gas emissions. This is, I'll just unpack this a little bit. There's a few factors underlying this. Firstly, achieving energy for all does not require a significant increase in global energy demand. It can be met with about 0.2% of increased energy demand, corresponding to a small CO2 rise from additional fossil fuels for clean cooking and electricity access. But this is more than offset by the reduction in methane emissions, which you get from removing traditional biomass from the global energy mix. The amount of biomass used by in developing countries for cooking has quite a strong greenhouse gas implication, and when you remove that, you actually see a net benefit for greenhouse gas emissions. So, I mean, I'll just quickly conclude is that, of course, achieving the SDGs is essential. Achieving SDG 7 is essential for improving livelihoods and meeting a whole range of development outcomes, and policy efforts are really key to the attainment of universal access. Policies should enable a wide range of fit-for-purpose solutions, obviously enabling policies for off-grid private sector companies to come in. Energy efficiency also needs to be the heart of electrification strategies, and also providing energy for productive uses needs to be to go hand in hand with household electrification. Universal clean cooking access won't be achieved unless it's raised on the policy agenda. And finally, energy access and climate goals are really not in conflict, and we want to push this out to the climate community, that energy poverty is, ending energy poverty is not going to be in conflict with the climate goals. Finally, the IEA continues to really work this year and will continue to work in providing this kind of data to the global community, its policy guidance and so on. This year is a very important year for the SDG 7 at the UN. The UN will for the first time give a very high level review of SDG 7 and track the progress, and we're very much involved in that policy, in that process. Finally, just to note that the report is free to download. All the underlying data is available to download. There are 2 web links there. The second one, iea.org/SDG, is a new web portal that we've launched in the past few weeks, which gives IEA data for all the 4 SDG indicators, which tracks just not only electricity and clean cooking, but also renewables and efficiency for 170 countries since 2000. So it gives a very rich data resource for any university researchers, and it also provides projections from the new policies and sustainable development scenarios. But thank you.
Thanks, Hannah. That's a tough gig, having to talk into a computer on your own in an office. So well done. Thank you for that. We're going to move on quickly because we are in the interest of time. I'll get the other 2 speakers up, and then we can ask questions, I think, of the 3 speakers at the end. So our next presenter, Tony, you ready? Is Dr. Tony Heynen, who very recently completed his PhD. Tony is a researcher in our group, the Energy Poverty Research Group at UQ. He undertook his Bachelor of Environmental Engineering at UQ many years ago. He has an MBA from NUS, National University of Singapore. Hello. And a Master of Engineering Science from the University of Melbourne. Tony is also a chartered professional engineer with extensive experience, I think that means he's old, in the resources sector, including as prior to his PhD in his latest round of study, he was country manager for the Italian energy company Eni in Timor-Leste. Tony. What? Oh, right. Hannah, can you stop sharing your screen, please? Oh, right. Thank you. You're up. Tony, you're up. Tony, you're up.
No.
I think.
Great. That's me. Yep. Perfect. And the mic is on. Perfect. Thank you. Thanks, Paul. Thanks for the intro. So yeah, I'm going to, I guess, drill down a little bit deeper in, and it's actually nice that I'm following Hannah, and then Yuwan will be presenting at a little bit deeper analysis after me. So I'm going to focus on the India level issue, particularly how the grid works in India, and having a look at how off-grid opportunities are present in the face of the dominant paradigm, which is the grid. So the stats, more specifically for India, so we know, as Hannah said, there's been a decline in, or an increase in energy access, but currently we know around 240 million people lack access to electricity in India. But also there are many millions more that don't have reliable access. So they have access, but the supply is unreliable. They're prone to blackouts, brownouts, etc. So in the context of the government providing grid electricity, I'm looking at the role of the private sector in providing off-grid electricity. And so looking at what the... 240 million people without access to electricity, but the government also has metrics on how electricity is progressing in India. And as Hannah mentioned, the Modi government recently announced a couple of weeks ago, 100% of villages in India are now connected to the grid. under this scheme, the DDUGJY. I won't go into the Hindi translation of that, but it's a big government initiative to provide village connections to all across India. So that's now at 100%. Then at the household level, there's another scheme, the Saubhagya scheme, which the government promotes to connect households to the electricity grid. So you've got village connections and household connections. But I guess how does that then translate to electricity use? So both these figures are about electricity access at a village level, access at a household level. But exactly how does that penetrate to the use of electricity by people? There are a few clouds which mean that the transition from village to household connections to electricity use doesn't quite flow quite so nicely. And that leaves us with this 240 million people without electricity access. So one of them is that there are these unconnected hamlets, these non-census hamlets. So they don't officially exist on the census of India, and these localities, small localities, don't then appear on the village connection data. Another cloud is what actually defines what's electrified. So in India, for a village to be counted as an electrified village, obviously you need a transformer in the village, but only 10% of the households in the village need to be connected for the village to be classified as electrified. Then moving from connections to actual use, well, you've got issues like, people have got to pay for the electricity or make a contribution to the electricity. So you've got affordability issues which might affect people actually using the household connections. And then, as I mentioned, this supply issues of quality, unreliability. There's load shedding in a lot of parts of India as well. So it means that the actual electricity use is a little bit up in the air. In fact, I guess it doesn't flow quite so linearly from village to household. Just to illustrate this a little bit more, so this is data from the World Bank, access to electricity in India. This is percentage of the world population. So we can see a nice upward trend, but we have these two kind of little worrying spots here. Well, I guess from my point of view, they're kind of ground truthings, and actually I'd be interested in Hannah's perspective on this as well. But these little dips occur when the census occurs in 2001 and 2011, every 10 years. So this could be evidence that there is generally an overestimation of electricity use, electricity access in India, which is kind of, I guess, ground truth, if you like, when there's actual door-to-door kind of surveys of what electricity is occurring in India. And just to dip a little bit more into that issue that I mentioned of hamlets, the forgotten hamlets, the non-census hamlets. So in December last year, I was fortunate enough to visit this village, Vanvasipada. And it's 110 kilometres from Mumbai, a huge city. And so it's around 2.5 hours drive. The village contains around 40 households. And it's in the tribal belt of India, of Maharashtra. So it's kind of tribal area. And definitely off the beaten track. It's a non-census village. Walking down into the village is quite beautiful, and you can see in the distance there the grid power lines, and you're like, well, what exactly? What's the problem? There should be connection there. In fact, the connection goes straight over the top of the rice paddies, the agricultural fields, and there's no connection to the village. The villagers can look at the power lines there, and in fact they can look at the rubbish, the spools of wire that have been left by the electricity transmission company, but they can't access the electricity that's been provided by the government. So in the absence of the government providing electricity, NGOs have come in and also the private sector. So there's an NGO called Pragati Pratishthan, which focuses on the livelihoods of tribal communities. They partnered with a private sector organisation, Gram Urja, which specialises in off-grid solutions. And Gram Urja got some funding from Bank of America, some corporate social responsibility funding. So together they introduced a mini-grid system into the village, which provides lighting, electricity for lighting, but also for productive use, rice milling and water pumping, etc. So in this case, it's pretty clear. The grid is not coming because the hamlet is not kind of officially registered by the government. So the private sector has some confidence that they can come in and provide solutions in this situation. But I was quite interested, and I am still quite interested in other energy providers in India and how they perceive the risks that are associated with the grid. Because obviously if the grid is coming or the grid is there, and the grid is coming according to the Government of India to everyone, then how does that, what room does that leave for the private sector and off-grid players? So during my PhD, I looked at 10 off-grid operators. I went to India and I interviewed them, semi-structured interviews. There are a few companies that provide more sort of personal solar lantern type devices, but I also focused on companies doing solar home systems right through to sort of mini-grid systems. And I really wanted to know kind of how they responded to the grid and how they structure their business models and value propositions. All of them have very strong social missions, because it's pretty hard to operate in the environment they're in, and definitely the uncertainty. But I tried to have a look at sort of the indicative positioning of these 10 firms, these kind of exemplar firms, to see where they might fit according to two axes. So the first axis is the perception of risk as a result of government electrification, whether they have a low risk, they're not too worried about the grid, versus a high risk, they're worried about the grid coming. And the other axis is value proposition. So I looked at the interactivity, how interactive they were with the society in which they operate, versus isolated models where they're kind of just delivering a product or service and not integrating that into the society. And I found two clusters of these companies. So of course there's only 10 companies, but there was a pattern. So there were companies that were worried about the grid. They definitely were worried about the grid, but to counter that, they had a policy and a business model of very high social embeddedness. So that was kind of a risk mitigation strategy that came out of that, to kind of protect them, to be embedded in the community such that they were protected against perhaps the grid coming, because the grid might come, but it might be a bit of an unreliable supply. And at the other cluster were these firms that weren't too worried about the grid. In fact, they generally provided kind of more personal or smaller devices. Affordability was the main value proposition for them, and for them, they really operated in places that these companies were convinced that the electricity grid was not going to reach these places. So this was interesting. It gave me a bit of an insight into kind of their modus operandi, if you like, in terms of how they perceive the grid and how they counter that with the integration in the community. So just to sum up, I guess don't have too much time, but there were some insights that I gained in terms of this research, which was, as I mentioned, they've got these forgotten hamlets which don't exist on the government schemes, and these are definitely an opportunity for the private sector. We've also got supply outages and unreliability, so there's opportunities for remedial secondary infrastructure. As I said, there's kind of these issues around metrics and lack of transparency, so that could be clarified to enable companies, private sector, to operate more effectively. And also yeah, there's in India at least degrees of political promise that's delivered to a lot of, a political promise. It's rolled out in political campaign. And there's not too much room at the moment for the private sector. So this could change because I really do believe that the private sector has an important role to play in off-grid solutions. The last slide is just a thank you slide to my supervisors and everyone here. And I'll hand back to Paul. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Hannay. Okay, and our final presenter is the gentleman standing here, Yuwan Malakar. You ready?
Yes.
You're just about to do a run-on. Yuwan is he's a PhD student in the Energy Poverty Research Group and also the Centre for Communication and Social Change here at UQ. His research investigates the underpinning social constructs of energy poverty in rural India and aims to generate lessons that have policy implications to the country. Yuwan is from Nepal and has a Master of Arts in Sociology. He has worked with non-government organisations for over 10 years in South Asia. Yuwan.
Well, thank you, Paul. Hello, everyone. My name is Yuwan, and thank you for coming to this event. Before starting my presentation, is this working? Okay. Before starting my presentation, I would like to thank Hannah and Tony, who unknowingly set this background for my presentation. So to reiterate, Hannah informed us about global progress on universal access to energy and emphasized why we need to transition from biomass-based cooking fuel to modern fuels. For instance, LPG, which is the short form for liquid petroleum gas. And Tony shed some light on what's happening at the national and state level in India. In my presentation, I will be talking about how these global and national commitments, national targets are translated at community and household scale. My focus is in cooking fuels in rural India. For my PhD, I did my fieldwork in Chittoor, which is a district in Andhra Pradesh, and you can see the red sort of circle in where I did my fieldwork. Yes, and there were 40 households in that village, mostly relying on agriculture and livestock for their livelihood, and all of them used primarily solid fuels, firewood particularly, for cooking. And the objective of my fieldwork was to identify, to find out why people are not adopting modern cooking fuels, for instance, again, LPG. And the first few days with people, talking to people, interacting with people was okay. And I had this impression in my mind based on my reading that people are not adopting improved cooking fuels because it's expensive and they can't afford it. So based on that impression, I started talking to people, households, until I saw this. So what do we see here? Yes, there's a TV signal receiver and a bunch of firewood together. Then I started questioning myself. Then I actually realized that every household's got TV, but only few households got LPG. And I started questioning myself why people have adopted LPG, but TV, but not LPG. Yeah, this was the question in my head after I saw this. And then I went back and looked at the national data. What does the national data tells us about the positions of TVs and LPG at country level. And this is what I found. This is the data of census 2011. And what do we see here again? Yes, in total, there are more TV owners than LPG users in India. And it is similar in both cases of rural and urban. Yes. Then I started, based on this unaffordability theory, I asked myself, in terms of expenditure, is keeping TV cheaper than using LPG for cooking? To understand this, I actually start talking to households in the village. I interviewed not more, but 12 households in the village. And out of those 12 households, there were 2 households who actually used LPG for cooking, but 10 households had TV. Again, TV owners were more than LPG users in the village. This question kept coming in my head: is keeping a TV cheaper than using LPG? Then I went to start discussing, collecting some data about how much does actually cost to keep a TV, and how much does actually it cost to use LPG for cooking. And this is what I found. So most families in the village owned a TV ranged between 8,000 to 9,000 INR, which is around 160 to 180 Australian dollar. Quite cheap though, but still. And what about annual subscription for TV channels? And it was around 1,920 to 2,400 INR per year. And was there any government subsidy? I found none. And let's talk about LPG expenditure then. If you are getting a new LPG connection, which comes along with a filled bottle of LPG and a brand new LPG stove with some accessories, and it costs around INR 3,075 Indian rupees, yes. And what about annual cost to refill and to use